Good afternoon. My name is Eileen, and I am the Director of Laying Continuing Education at Brite Divinity School, and I would like to welcome you today to this inaugural third Thursday Conversations with Brite faculty. It's our first time, so we're trying some new things, and we'll be looking for some feedback at the end. But I'm sure by now most people are well aware of Zoom etiquette, but just to remind people to mute your mics. And we'll have a presentation predominantly by Dr. Stephen Sprinkle, and we'll hold off and have our questions at the end. Because we are recording this session, and you'll be able to access that later, but we would ask you, because there's a number of people on the Zoom call today, if you would submit any questions through chat. And then we will kind of voice those for you at the end. So I wanted people to be aware that we're recording and to submit your questions to chat at the end. We've got some of our support here today. Just to introduce you to them is Lauren Baxter. I don't know if he can wave, but he's here, and Holly Neal will also be helping voice those questions for you, questions or comments at the end. You can also, the chat room's open, so you can submit other questions or comments as we go along if you're having any difficulty with the session. And with that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Stephen Sprinkle, who is our professor of practical theology. He also directs the field education supervised ministry and is director of Baptist programming. So Steve, would you like to take it away?
Thank you, Eileen, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for sharing part of your day with us here at Brite Divinity School. I really am deeply appreciative of the work that Eileen Thielig, Holly Ann Neal, and Lauren Baxter have done to make this conversation possible. And it is good to be able to meet, virtually at least, friends who are continuing friends and brand new ones. I'm glad to be here with you and happy that you can be here with us. The topic for today is lament as ministry. I believe we need to access the strange power of lament in these seasons of grief and loss, anger and anxiety, and the underlying need for hope that cries out for the souls, from the souls of people all across the land. Public ritual lament is a life-giving resource we need to employ during this time of COVID-19, recession, and Black Lives Matter. We'll say more about that in just a moment. So lament as ministry is the overall theme of our time together today. How does a community respond in ritual and in prayer to violence or to disaster? What words do we say? What practices of ministry can break through the numbness of a society overwhelmed with grief and anxiety? Could anything possibly be more needful or timely during this period of extraordinary frustration? The psalmist strikes at the very heart of what this session is about. In Psalm 102 in verses 5 through 7, in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the psalm reads this way: "Because of my loud groaning, My bones cling to my skin. I am like an owl in the wilderness, like a little owl of the waste places. I lie awake. I'm like a lonely bird on the housetop. What a poignant image that last line is. I am like a lonely bird on the housetop. The Pauline community turns toward the Holy Spirit and in pain and hope speaks these words from Romans 8:26. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. Moaning like a bird on a housetop, sighing in the Spirit with vocalizations too deep for words. You see here up on your screen the outline for this session for the rest of this afternoon. You see that it's parsed out into 4 segments. Segment 1 will be an introduction to our moaning partners. Segment 2, Lament as a community practice. Segment 3, Lament as ministry and the rupture of ministry itself. Then, like Eileen has told us, we'll have Q&A and closing in segment 4. You'll hear me having a brief cueing conversation throughout this session with my friend Lauren Baxter, just like this. Lauren, could we go to the next slide, please? Our moaning partners. That's a provocative term, isn't it? The moan. It conjures up all kinds of feelings and images with you, I'm sure, just like it does for me. By being spoken, the moan duplicates the deep, agonizing sounds that it names. But there is far more to the moan than that. Actually, it is a shorthand for the sighs and groans of individuals and groups, and something as great, perhaps, as even the nation or the whole human race. I look at the moan in 2 distinct ways. First, as an expression that comes from individuals, from grief and loss, from frustration and from misery. Moaning like that is not strange to any of us. And the second way I look at it is corporately, not in terms of big corporations, but in terms of the whole aggregate of groups and society. In other words, here we're talking about the moan of the people. But whether we look at the moan through an individual lens or through a social corporate lens, both are expressed bodily. And this is important to me. The moan is a bodily expression. It's not just a disembodied voice. Bodily, our whole selves resonate with the moan. And if you have ever moaned yourself or been in the presence of someone who in frustration and pain was moaning, or a great group of people sighing with virtually one voice, you can feel it all the way through your bodies. I have a conviction about all this, that there is a different character of the moan as it rises from a social body. In that sense, individual moans dwell in the larger mansion of a greater reality, the moan of the people. Our individual expressions of moaning, our sighs, are all expressions of that greater moan that rises from us all. The moan, then, is never alone. No matter how it feels or manifests itself in any particular situation. The moan is communal by its very nature. Therefore, all who moan have moaning partners. And today, for our presentation, so do we. Let me direct you back to the pictures that are portrayed on this slide. You can see below the title, Our Moaning Partners, a composite picture, a series of representations of Jesus. Jesus is one, but at the same time, Jesus is many. Because in all cultures and times and places, to all sorts and conditions of people, Jesus comes and is present and dwells in the midst of where people moan and sigh. The larger picture is, I think, a beautiful and extraordinary painting by the Russian Ivan Krasnotsky, who painted this picture of Jesus in the wilderness in 1872. You can almost sense the depth of feeling, of agony and yearning in the Jesus portrayed in this larger picture. Jesus of Nazareth may not be the very first human being to moan chronologically. That's been done, so far as we know, since the dawn of our human existence on the earth. But in another sense, Jesus really is first and foremost. For Jesus is the first among us to moan theologically. The moaning of the humanity of God is in Jesus, and therefore is in the heart of God, God's self. That's a pretty big thought. Jesus had to get his vocabulary from somewhere. And I believe that his vocabulary arises from the sighs and the groans of those who preceded him biblically. From Hagar, agonizing with her young son in the desert. Rizpah, weeping for her sons. Rachel, lamenting for the slaughtered innocents, butchered at the hands of Herod. Jesus' own mother, sighing and groaning in her birth pangs and in grief at his death. And Mary, we call the Magdalene, at the foot of his cross on the day in which Jesus was crucified. And there are others Jesus draws his vocabulary for moaning from. From the forerunners, those we call the matriarchs and the patriarchs, from the prophets and the sages of Israel, among whom are Abel, whose innocent blood cries out from the ground after his murder by his own brother. Jacob, who moans at the loss of the promise and the discovery of his chosenness. Job, who agonizes on his dung heap covered in boils. Hosea, Isaiah, and of course, the one we call the weeping prophet, Jeremiah. Above all the Israelite poets we group together and call the psalmist give Jesus the greater part of his vocabulary. We'll have much more to say about the Psalms, particularly the Psalms of Lament, as we go forward with this program. May I have the next slide, please? The example par excellence of Jesus drawing his moaning vocabulary from the Psalms is Psalm 22. Just to give voice to it, I'd like to read from a particularly favored translation of the Psalms called the Grail version, which was actually done so that the Psalms could be sung as they were originally intended to be expressed back in the Temple of Jerusalem. From Psalm 22. See if you can hear resonances in the life and the death of Jesus within this psalm. My God, why have you forsaken me? You are far from my plea and the cry of my distress. Oh my God, I call by day and you give no reply. I call by night and I find no peace. But I am a worm and no man, the butt of men, laughing stock of the people. All who see me deride me. They curl their lips. They toss their heads. He trusted in the Lord. Let him save him. Let him release him if he is his friend. Like water I am poured out. Disjointed are all my bones. My heart is become like wax. It is melted within my breast. Parched as burnt clay is my throat. My tongue cleaves to my jaws. Many dogs have surrounded me. A band of the wicked beset me. They tear holes in my hands and my feet and lay me in the dust of death. I can count every one of my bones. Those who stare at me gloat. They divide my clothing among them. They cast lots for my robe. Selections from Psalm 22. You can hear and feel the agony of the moan of humanity in God. And perhaps you catch glimpses of the crucifixion as it is portrayed in the center panel on this slide. A depiction painted by Matthias Grunewald, excuse me, on a triptych called the Isenheim Altarpiece. The agony of the moan of humanity and God virtually heaves from Jesus on the cross, as this detail from the Isenheim Altarpiece shows. Many have called this particular altarpiece and this depiction of Jesus' crucifixion as the most difficult to view and yet the most passionate of any that have ever been done in art. And to the left of the Jesus figure on the cross, Grunewald has painted Mary Magdalene, fallen down on her knees at the foot of the cross in horror, in the horror playing out before her eyes and now before ours. See how her hands wring in some sort of physical attempt to give a sign of how her grief feels. If the 150 Psalms are considered in total, nearly 30% of them are laments or complaints. Dr. Walter Brueggemann calls the Psalms of Lament Psalms of Dislocation, as he says in this clip of a lecture of his from February the 8th, 2010, called Disorientation, Faith in the Depths. Lauren, please play it for us.
Almost 1/3 of the 150 Psalms are laments, complaints, protests. That's a lot. And for most of the church, Anglicans probably are a little bit different, but not much. For most of the church, the only psalm of disorientation that we use is Psalm 22, because we can't avoid it, because Jesus quoted it on the cross. So it does come up in the lectionary and in the liturgy, but we, by and large, are free to neglect those others. So what we do is to deny the rhetoric of the church, the language of disorientation. And as I said last night, I believe that blanking out that third of the book of Psalms invites people to great guilt. So if something's wrong, it's my fault. Or it invites people to great denial that I have to keep pretending it's working when in fact it is not working. So what I want to suggest is that what the Psalms of disorientation do is to lift up and call attention to the reality of human loss and human pain without making moral judgments about it, about whose fault it is. It is simply a given of human life that needs to be processed theologically. And these Psalms, it seems to me, are so important because they are models of the way in which ancient Israel and then the church learns to have faith in the midst of disorientation and pain and loss, and learns to worship and pray in the midst of disorientation and pain and loss.
Thank you, Lauren. Would you kindly pause the screen share now so I can see everyone and everyone can see me? Thank you. So let's spend some time feeling our way through these Psalms of Lament, guided along the way by Brueggemann, who says that these Psalms of Lament are Israel's classic model of grief, pain, and rage. Psalms that have 6 consistent elements that we're going to take a look at briefly. The first element is the naming of God with an intimate address. My God, or O God of my fathers, are 2 good examples. The lament is not made to a stranger. No matter the anger or the pain that the psalmist feels, the voice of the psalm speaks in the midst of a trusting relationship. God knows us, is hearing us, and listens to us. Neither is the lament offered to an empty sky. The God addressed is intently listening to what the psalmist has to say. The second element. In the second element, the psalm moves directly to the complaint and is often a complaint that is overstated, like perhaps we did as children by crying all the more loudly to make sure that our parents paid attention to us. Overstatement is directly related to pain, after all. But this may also be a calculation on the part of the psalmist that is meant to persuade or even to cajole God into acting. It's meant to rouse the Holy One. Brueggemann says that God must be recruited into the trouble the lament concerns. The third element. The psalm focuses on a petition, asking. As Karl Barth said, the most basic form of prayer is asking for something. The lament addresses God with a large ask, an unapologetic cry for divine action. Turn to me, hear me, heal me, save me. The speaker knows that everything depends on God being mobilized to attention, to hearing the laments and the complaints of Israel. The fourth element. The lament cannot leave petition or complaint before God without saying something more. This is what Brueggemann calls regressive speech. And it sits at the core of lamentation. Motivations are piled on top of the petition. God's virtue, God's faithfulness, compassion, or even God's vanity are appealed to give the Holy One a sufficient reason to act on what God hears. Psalms of lament and complaint show that faith can leave respectability behind and even make unorthodox appeals. Crying out in extremis is often like this. Fifth, the speaker often goes beyond a cry from rescue or healing. An element of vengeance upon an evildoer or punishment upon an enemy who has caused all this hurt may also be integral to the lamentation and to the complaint. In addition to the good that God is asked to do, God is often called on to do something to punish and to hurt, even something destructive to the human who hurt the petitioner. It's not very polite, is it? But polite theology and proper social mores are simply left outside the door of lamentation and pain. For the ugliness of life cannot be avoided when someone has been gravely wounded. The speaker dares to speak what is darkest and most venomous in the human psyche, gritting teeth in the ongoing experience of pain and grief and anger. And finally, the sixth element. Once the need, the hurt, the demands, and the venom are fully spoken in the psalm, then something unexpected happens. The mood and the tone of the psalm change. Once the grief and the anger of Israel are spent, the turn is toward hope, toward a positive resolution. The speaker declares that they are confident they have been heard and that God will deal with them bountifully. How this happens exactly What transformation in the speaker takes place in these psalms, we're just not sure. Nonetheless, it is abundantly clear that these psalms of lament and complaint decidedly take this turn. Perhaps it is that the communal liturgical utterance of the lamentation may have been cathartic to the speaker, a relief in itself to be vocalized. A liturgical intervention of new assurance comes to the psalmist. The lament culminates in something unexpected. In instances that summon us to a new covenantal relationship with God and with one another. Here's where the psalm of lament becomes truly dialogical. Humans speak, God hears, and change occurs. And the psalmist leaves the encounter in a very different place. Now back to the slide, please, Lauren. We commence segment 2, the case for lament as a community practice, by learning from our moaning partners, Walter Brueggemann, Ann Weems, and Barbara A. Holmes, whose pictures you see on this slide. May we have the next slide too. Brueggemann is professor of Old Testament emeritus at Columbia Theological Seminary in Georgia. And he's the author of this book pictured on this slide, The Prophetic Imagination. This is a book of remarkable durability and immediate relevance. It has what authors like to call legs, because although it was written 42 years ago, in its successive editions, and this one pictured is the 40th edition, 40th year, it still is amazingly relevant. Briefly, Brueggemann's claims in this book are the bedrock of my understanding of lament as ministry. He argues that public communal lamentation is a task for all ministers, priests, and religious leaders to perform. Let me read this quote off the slide for you. Brueggemann's argument for lament is that it is an antidote for corporate numbness. He writes, the task is to bring to public expression the very hopes and yearnings that have been denied so long and suppressed so deeply that we no longer know that they are there. Some might call this neglect of hope and yearning for the coming of God as amnesia, but not Brueggemann. He insists instead that it is a deadening of our longing for God's reign due to the effect of living in the powerful narcotic embrace of empire, of false security, denial of sickness and death, the bait and switch of totalizing imperial power that displaces and makes us look to the system or the status quo for everything we need and not from our faith, instead of justice, mercy, and new creation. Imagination is deadened and numbness sets in to replace it. We become, Brueggemann says, the numb ones, who no longer see our responsibility and capacity to imagine a God-inspired world of shalom and newness of life. May we have the next slide, please? Brueggemann declares that something new and something unexpected happened in the history of the world with the Exodus and with the Jesus movement. This took place in two divinely sanctioned acts. First, Moses intended the dismantling of the oppressive empire of Pharaoh. And second, Moses intended the formation of a new community focused on the religion of God's freedom and the politics of justice and compassion. But there's dismantling involved too. The dismantling of the pretense of empire begins in the groanings and complaints of the people. Have you ever thought that groaning dismantles power? Brueggemann says it does. And then there is an element of energizing that occurs in this movement too. The energizing for the rebirth of hope, which begins in the doxologies or praises of God that the new community raises up. The prophets of Israel followed the same pattern. Jeremiah voices the bitter tears of the people and initiates radical criticism of oppressive systems, earning the name the weeping prophet. The prophet we call Second Isaiah penetrates the weary despair that anything new is ever possible by his strange practices of resistance, energizing a radically new imagination for the reign of God and kindling amazing and powerful visions of something new. Amazement in the public rebirth of a reborn Israel. And in Jesus called the Christ, who is a prophet and more than a prophet, the practices of prophetic imagination and ministry come to incarnate reality in all their most radical and durable ways. The dismantling comes in the crucifixion as an expression of deep grief and loss, and the unjust dismantling of Jesus himself. And then the energizing takes place in the resurrection of Jesus from the grave, leading to what Daniel Oudshorn calls the continuing uprising of all those left for dead, the colonized, enslaved, impoverished, marginalized, broken, outcast, and lost. This ministry is passed on to us, to the numb ones of our time, to awaken, dismantle, and energize our ministries into an uprising of actual concrete practices of justice and hope. The price of awakening to a new hope-filled imagination against oppression and into the world of greater justice and compassion is to face grief, death, and loss head on for the awful realities they are. To Brueggemann, death is utterly and horribly real. Take, for example, what he says here on this slide. Hope expressed without knowledge of and participation in grief is likely to be false hope that does not reach despair. It is precisely those who know death most painfully who can speak hope most vigorously. Let that sink in for just a moment or two. I'm sure, like myself, you need to catch your breath after a heavy moment like that. And as you do, I want to begin to introduce the work of two other authors the poet Anne Weems, and the former seminary president, Dr. Barbara A. Holmes. First, Anne Weems then. Will you kindly pause the screen share for just a moment and switch back to me, please, Lauren? Thanks. The poet Anne Weems, author of Psalms of Lament, faced grief and loss in one of the most dreaded forms it can ever take, the death of a child. Less than an hour after his 21st birthday, her beloved son, Todd, was killed. The grief crushed her, and in some ways, all the rest of her life, she never fully recovered from it. Not that any one of us truly would recover from it either. That is what makes her work so poignant and important on the question of lament as ministry. One of the few people in her life to keep checking in on her long after Todd's funeral and the incredibly difficult loneliness that sets in when everyone else has gone back to their lives was Walter Brueggemann. He kept at it with caring tenacity, calling on Anne time after time. She declared to him in one of those moments that she was so wounded she felt she could never see her way past Todd's death. So Brueggemann suggested that she do what she did best as a poet and writer. He advised her to write, but not just anything, to write a psalm of lament. What an absurd idea. One that she put off and she denied until somehow she actually wrote one. As she says in the preface to her book, she tore out the sheets and she threw them on a desk drawer and she slammed that drawer shut. After a long spell, she wrote another one, and then another, and another, always putting them in that desk drawer and slamming it shut. Finally, she accumulated 5 of these poems of lament. So she sent them to Walter Brueggemann to show him that she had actually heard him and paid attention to what he said. And when he took a look at them, he was so moved, he asked permission to share her Psalms of Lament with a seminar that he was teaching. The response that Anne Weems got amazed her. She began to get appreciations and stories of loss and of thanks from all sorts of folks who said that she helped them voice what was going on in their hearts, that they themselves were helped by her laments. So she paid attention. She wrote more, eventually collecting 50 of these Psalms of Lament in her remarkable book of the same name. Just to give you a sample of one of Anne Weems' Psalms of Lament, I've chosen one, number 32. Let me read it for you. O God, explain to me the cruelty of your world. Make sense of those who make no sense. Tell me why the innocent die and evil people live to kill again. Tell me why the faithful are shunned and the self-righteous point their fingers. Tell me why the wounded are wounded and sorrow falls on the shoulder of sorrow. Tell me why the abused are abused and the victims victimized. Tell me why the rains come to the drowning and aftershocks follow earthquakes. Oh God, is this any way to run a world? Oh merciful one, let us rest between tragedies. Speak to us, for we are your people. Speak to us of hope for the hopeless, and love for the unloved, and homes for the homeless, and dignity for the dying, and respect for the disdained. Speak to us, O God, of the resurrected one. Speak to us of hope, for in spite of the tidal wave of tears, we remember your story of new life. Tell the world again, O God of creation. Tell us that winter will fade, and spring will wash us new, and the world will green again, and we will be new creations in the garden of our God. Free us from these tentacles of sorrow, and we will fall on our faces and worship you, O God of goodness, O God of a new green world. Each of us learn how to lament by trial and error, I think. May we see that previous slide again, please, Lauren. Anne Weems had to learn how to lament by trial and error. Some, like she, learned that their best acts of ministry arise from their own graves of grief and loss by simply offering their presence to others. Like my old mentor in seminary, Father Henry Nouwen, said about being wounded healers. At the end of the preface of her book, she wrote something unexpected, that healing happens to reveal the possibility of lamentation. And I share it with you on this slide. She wrote, "In the forsaken, obscene quicksand of life, there is a deafening alleluia arising from the souls who weep, and of those who weep with those who weep. If you watch, you will see the hand of God putting the stars back unto their skies, one by one." May we have the next slide, please. The final moaning partner for this segment is Dr. Barbara A. Holmes, and we have a connection with her here in North Texas. She was first ordained in Dallas in the Apostolic Church tradition. Professor, writer, lawyer, and once president of United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, Dr. Holmes authored the book shown here, Joy Unspeakable, Contemplative Practices of the Black Church. She declares that the story of Black people in America is the sound of the moan inside and out from beginning till end, a moan born in the terror of chattel slavery. The journey of the moan from West Africa through the Atlantic Ocean on the Middle Passage is a pre-verbal discovery of new depths of misery. The 401-year agony of America's original sin robbed Black people of their languages, their cultures, their families, and for multitudes of people, their very lives. And yet moans are also a chosen utterance, giving voice to something so primal that silence could never do. The moan, as a chosen language of lament, is a new contribution to our understanding of lamentation as ministry. She writes, "Sometimes words will not come either to affirm or betray. It is at that time that the moan becomes the vehicle for articulating that which can never be voiced. Moans are the utterances of choice when circumstances snatch words and prayers from bereft lips." The next slide, please. Holmes writes that the moan is the beginning of a new spiritual vocabulary. Listen to what she has to say about that. The moan became the first vocalization of a new spiritual vocabulary, terrible and wonderful. It was a cry, a critique, a prayer, a hymn, a sermon, all at once. The only sound that would carry Africans over the bitter waters was the moan. If the journey is as liminal as it is actual, the moan is the vehicle that carries the afflicted community toward transcendence. The moans of lament from deep in the soul, emerging from the hurts of the community, are a whole new language for ministry, a language that Eurocentric churches and Eurocentric ministers seem to have forgotten, as if they ever actually knew it at all. What the moan becomes, according to Holmes, is a ministry vehicle, like a ship in stormy waters, carrying God's afflicted people through trouble to transcendence. Next slide, please. We are co-creating a new language of ministry with the children of Israel and with the crucified and risen one as we go. Lament is the beginning of authentic public ministry in an age of COVID, recession, the assassinations of Black people, and all those left for dead by the regimes of the dead. Brueggemann opened this conversation among moaning partners by saying that lament is more than a ritual of catharsis or a psychological cleansing, as important as those are. In his small treatise on the coronavirus, just off the press, he says that people who lead must learn to groan truthfully. We're walking here in the utterly liminal territory between raw misery on the one hand and birth pangs on the other, between meaningless pain and the contractions of a new birth. Here's what he says in Virus as a Summons to Faith. The cycles of denial can only be broken among us by the truth of the groan. Without the groan, there is no birth of newness. Without hope, there is no move out of the groan. Creation's groan cannot of itself bring newness, but the groan is surely a human sine qua non for its coming. And if a prerequisite is creation's groan and birth pangs, then the human creature, who has most misunderstood our assigned role in creation, must do most of the groan. Authentic Christian ministry in an age like ours is similar to the very first era of Christianity on the earth. You know, our spiritual forebears were not climbers up the social honor-encrusted ladder of upward mobility or up the pyramid of oppression. No, the Moses people and the Jesus people flipped the upward ladder on its head, leading Christian witnesses and workers into the mud and blood and grime where people live and love and laugh and groan and hope for newness of life. Like the witnesses of the New Testament, ministry today must crawl upon the earth instead of ascending the ladder. And if we take Weems, Holmes, Brueggemann, and yes, Jesus, at their word, we must enter authentic ministry through the gateway of the groan. The next slide, please. In the New Testament, Brueggemann writes, it is the voice of Friday from the cross that opens the way to Easter newness. Now we are ready for segment 3. Lament as ministry and the rupture of ministry. The final teaching segment I've prepared for this encounter with you begins where all practical theology begins, by taking stock of the situation facing us. Practical theologians and practical religious leaders work from what is going on in the situations that confront communities of faith. And then we move onward into a new unknown. The fancy way of talking about this action is called moving from an original naivete through questioning the situation in the light of faith onto a brand new naivete, where we know more, but we have many more questions. Ours is a situation of triple pandemics, of COVID-19, of economic recession, and the awakening of society to the evils of anti-Black racism. I believe that the crisis of the death of Lazarus, an echo of the rest of the resurrection stories in the New Testament prior to Jesus' own uprising from the dead, has resources to engage the situations facing church and society in this awful moment of triple pandemic. May we see the next slide, please. Note this picture, The Resurrection of Lazarus by Henry Asala Tanner, painted in 1896. The painting betrays a knowledge of death as commonplace to the artist, because in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, death was close. It was almost as close as it was to those who lived in the first century CE, for life expectancy was short. The context of the story of the raising of Lazarus is a matrix of mortality. It is a story of disease and shockingly normal misery in first century CE Palestine. We don't know how old the brother of Mary and Martha of Bethany was at the time he sickened and died, or what killed him. His sisters, we're told in John 11, sent an urgent message to Jesus to come attend to his friend, for Lazarus, they said, was sick. We can only conjecture that Lazarus succumbed to a disease. The general life expectancy of a Palestinian Jew in the first century was 35 years of age or less. People who sickened died rapidly. Though Jesus gets the word, strangely, he waits 2 more days before heading to Bethany. By the time Jesus and his entourage arrive, Lazarus has been in the tomb long enough to decay. The smell of death is rife, strong enough that Martha, who accuses Jesus of neglecting her brother's need, tries to stop the men from opening Lazarus' tomb when Jesus tells them to, for she says, "No, Lord, the smell is too bad." The overpowering stench of death heightens the power of the sign Jesus performs by raising Lazarus from the dead. Will you pause the screen share for a moment, please? The summons of Jesus, Lazarus come forth, is one of the most dramatic scenes in all the Gospels. The grave wrappings are removed, as Jesus says, in an obvious double entendre. Unbind him and let him go. Lazarus is released not only from his grave wrappings, but from the grip of death itself. Jesus breaches the unbreachable wall between death and life. In the last sign he performs before his own crucifixion and resurrection, not long in the future. So, Jesus performs a proto-resurrection by raising Lazarus, showing the power of God. But bear in mind that this is only a temporary reprieve of death for Lazarus. One day he is destined to re-enter his sick room, and this time he will never come out of it alive. Until, that is, the general resurrection of the dead, set in motion by the miracle par excellence of the Christian faith, the uprising of Jesus forevermore from the grave. Death, you see, is no illusion. Endings are real. The smell of death and captivity to the grave is still reigning, even in the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. But as the gospel performance occurs here in John 11, death is not the whole story. Our social and medical regimes are indeed a world away from first century Palestine. That's an indisputable fact. And yet medical advances and improved life expectancy notwithstanding, like Brueggemann, Weems, and Holmes say, we are not very far at all from the triad of woes the people of ancient Israel and the people of Jesus' time struggled with. War, or the deadly violence that takes our lives, pandemic disease, or pestilence in the language of the Bible, and the inevitable follow-on to both of them, famine or starvation. Biblical laments cry out to God against the miseries brought on by all these three. And like Mary and Martha of Bethany, we wonder and cry out, where is Jesus? Where is God? Why us? Where is our deliverance? Now back to the next slide, please. COVID-19 is surely the pestilence of our century. Nothing in our lifetimes approaches COVID-19. You know the statistics as well as I do, and the perils. In America alone, 119,471 are dead of COVID as of yesterday, and 2,205,567 Americans are confirmed infected by the virus, not to mention all of those across this globe of ours. But the death toll and the economic recession seem to be in a wrestling match for the attention of a chaotic and ineffective government. And the public, tired of restrictions, fearful of economic ruin, with good cause, and choking with what my own dear pastor calls quarantine fever, acting as if the virus threat is over, though it is not, seem to ignore the news coming out of China that there is a second wave mounting there in Beijing. Meanwhile, ministry is on the ropes about what to do and how to do it. I've got to admit that I have no clearer notion about a way forward for church life and witness than anyone else. The siege of pressure is enormous. The next slide, please. At the same moment, white America's fever of denial about America's 401-year racist nightmare is finally beginning to break, in no small measure because of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of 4 Minneapolis police officers, one arrested and charged with second-degree murder, and 3 others with abetting and aiding second-degree murder. The upheaval is unlike anything we have seen since the chaos surrounding the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. Clergy are beginning to see the spiritual import and the implications of the passion of George Floyd, turning aside the temptation to romanticize his life and death, or to turn him into a Christ figure in an act of spiritual injustice toward him and his family. We still have to admit there are rhymes of the Lazarus story and the passion of Jesus that echo in the 8 minutes and the 46 seconds that a policeman's knee was on George Floyd's neck while he gasped out, "I can't breathe," and called for his recently deceased mama before the life was pressed out of him. Is public lamentation and moaning just another species of street protest or activism? Is it simply a theological way of venting anger and pain? Is lamentation just another way of revisiting the age-old questions of theodicy, how God could let bad things happen? Or is something else going on in the ritual practice of moaning before God? I'd like to turn now to the next slide. What I've provided here in this last segment is a model for what ritual lament will look like. So let's take a brief look at a sample template for ritual lament that religious leaders can use in a variety of settings, all of them communal and all of them public. And the source for much of this comes from J. Frank Henderson's Liturgies of Lament. Liturgies of Lament are built at the intersection of love, outrage, and tragedy. As people of faith, we know even in times of violence and oppression that God does not turn away from us, nor does God turn away from any person or any other portion of creation that experiences disaster. So when we lament violence or disaster or pandemics, we do not, as 1 Corinthians 4 says, grieve as those without hope. Moved by the sighs of the Holy Spirit too deep for words, we respond to tragedy, disaster, violence, and oppression in prayer and in ritual together whenever trouble strikes. We open ourselves to the possibilities of transformation, letting go of what no longer successfully ministers to the suffering world, and learn to lean into the works of compassion and charity. Liturgies of lament lead toward real justice and compassion work, concrete works of love that flow back into our prayer and our life together in constant circulation. This is what Father Alexander Schmemann meant when he said, "We do liturgy for the life of the world." Liturgies of lament are expressions of the communal worship of God. And while anything that gathers people is at least in some sense political, communal public lament is not an occasion for theological debates, consciousness raising, or politically charged rallies, as important as all of these expressions truly are. In liturgy, we enter into communion with one another and with God, and in doing so, we are transformed. Through carefully chosen music, words, readings, postures, and gestures, we're led into the presence of the Holy One, who is compassionate, steadfastly loyal, and yet utterly free. To enter ritually into God's presence is always, however, to bear in mind that God is not on call at our whim, or that God is some sort of fortune cookie, as Walter Brueggemann says. The next slide, please, Lauren. As practical theology and practical liturgical leaders know, the ins and outs of constructing liturgies involves adopting the pattern of the Psalms of lament and complaint we've already examined today. The rite that I offer here and in this larger type may be a bit easier for us to look at, follows the model of the Psalter. Calling upon God, complaint, petition and assurance, summons to transformation, and then closing. May we have the next slide, please? Here is a note. The liturgy shown here will be sent to you by email after the session, and it can be used anywhere you see fit. So you don't have to rush to write anything down. The concluding slide, please. As I come to the closure of this practical segment, I want to consider what happens through a spirit-gifted lament that moves a community from self-centered concerns to transformation. A moment of change occurs in lamentation, one that moves out of the self-centered obsessment with ourselves and our need to the possibility of a renewed relationship between two free agents. The God who is ever free, and we ourselves who've been granted freedom by the love of God. What happens in the midst of ritual and communal lament is something I cannot explain. It is a moment of sheer grace-induced insight. The psalmist in Psalm 77 pivots from selfishness to grateful praise. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. Hope is reborn. In closing, let me remind everyone that there are no guarantees with God, just like there are no sure cures for COVID or painless justice for George Floyd. Lament presumes God's utter freedom. Instead, the words and deeds calculated to manipulate God or psychologically adjust the attitudes of the people are ruled out of this model of lament, because this lament summons the participants to respond in honesty and in pain and in doubt. It is a way made out of no way, out of the Exodus and out of the experience of the upper room from Good Friday to Easter. No guarantees, but something nonetheless marvelous happens. Companionship between humanity and divinity until a way is made out of no way. So let's catch our breath, you and me, stretch a bit, and then move on to some questions and answers, and then to our dismissal. So I'll turn this now over into the hands of our able moderators.
Thank you, Dr. Sprinkle. Just a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, if you could go ahead and put it in the chat. Either Lauren or Holly or I will voice that for you. And while you're coming up with your questions, I just want to thank Dr. Sprinkle for the work that he has done with this, along with Lauren and Holly, to put it together. We've talked about there'll be a follow-up email that will have not only the references that Dr. Sprinkle mentioned and the liturgy, but also the link to this recording. Give us a day or two to get the recording processed and in a location that would be accessible for you. And also on that, there'll be a link for a survey. If you can help us figure out maybe the right way to do these. Today was a trial error, so we are interested in your comments. I know an hour and a half is often quite long for a Zoom meeting, but the materials seem to be important. So wanted to put that in. And yes, there's a question about the slides. The slides should be, if we did it correctly, the slides are embedded in the presentation. So you will be able to see them. I don't think they'll be available for you to actually use yourself, but they will be available. You can access them on the YouTube channel that will have that. And let's see. Okay, yes, we intend to have these hopefully on a regular basis if they are beneficial to people. Our next one will be third Thursday of July, again at 1:30 in the afternoon. It'll be Dr. Joretta Marshall, and she'll kind of come out on the other side of this with resiliency and hope and talk about those two topics. And there's also a place on the feedback form if there are other things you would like to see in this conversation series. We're interested in that, and we can get a schedule lined up for next year. Questions?
There look like a lot of them in the chat.
Michael Richter does have his hand raised.
Sure.
All right, Michael.
I actually clicked the wrong button. Sorry, I was trying to navigate somewhere else. I'm good. I'm enjoying the conversation, and
Okay.
we're good.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, Michael. Good to hear from you.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to hear your voice again.
So someone has asked if the images and the painters and artists are listed. Will you have a list of that?
Sure. I can do
Okay.
that. Happy.
We'll try to attach those as well. And are there other books that you would recommend? I forget what your references listed, but are they others besides what you listed in the conversation?
There's a whole literature about lamentation, both biblical commentaries like those on the Psalms, but there are other books that give us resources for this. And of course, there are other collections of liturgies of lament too. We can make some suggestions about those if you like. I've relied primarily upon Walter Brueggemann because he makes such a coherent and cogent argument. And I think that Barbara Holmes gives us a new way of appreciating what a sigh is like, what a moan can be when it is born in the midst of terror, as both a curse and a blessing, a language of choice. I don't think anybody can get any closer to the central meaning of the Psalms of Lament than Anne Weems, in speaking as she does after the death of her beloved son, Todd. But there are sure other gifts out there.
Someone has also suggested Spirit and Trauma by Shelley Rambo.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think Joretta Marshall has talked about that book. I bet she'll bring it up.
I will.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see if anybody has asked a question that we haven't actually addressed. If you want to go ahead and give a shout out, that'd be great. And someone else has suggested praying your goodbyes, but don't know the author. Okay, so just a reminder, we'll follow up with an email once we get some of these references together, and it'll have a link to the recording and also a link to a survey. We really appreciate you being with us this afternoon and hope to see you again in July. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sprinkle.
Jazz hands.
Jazz hands.